السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'm Dr. Ahmed Muntasir, lecturer of Ophthalmology, Helwan University, and today I'm going to present an introduction to ocular anatomy. The eye is the primary organ of vision. Each eyeball is located within the orbital cavity of the skull, where it takes up about 1/5 of the orbital volume, and the remaining space is filled with extraocular muscles, fascia, lacrimal glands, blood and nerve supply of the eye. The ocular structures. The eye has three coats: outer, middle, and inner coats. The outer layer is fibrous and is formed of the cornea anteriorly and the sclera posteriorly. The middle layer is formed of iris, ciliary body, and the choroid, while the inner layer is formed from retinal pigment epithelium and the neurosensory retina. The eye is divided into an anterior segment and posterior segment. The anterior segment has two chambers, the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber, while the posterior segment is filled with the vitreous humor, which is filling the vitreous cavity. The eye has three intraocular fluids: aqueous humor, vitreous humor, and blood. The aqueous humor is a clear watery solution formed of water and electrolytes, which is similar to the plasma except it has a low protein content, while the vitreous humor is formed of collagen fibers as well as hyaluronic acid and water. The blood. Most of the blood lies within the choroid. The choroid blood flow represents the largest blood flow per unit tissue in the body. The outer coat of the eye is formed from cornea anteriorly and the sclera posteriorly, with a transition zone in between called the limbus. The cornea occupies the 1/6 of the outer coat, while the remaining part is the sclera. The cornea is transparent, whereas the sclera is white. The cornea is the transparent part of the outer coat. It's formed from 5 layers, arranged from the anterior to posterior as epithelium with its basement membrane, Bowman's layer, stroma, Descemet's membrane, and endothelium. The epithelium is a stratified squamous type, which is lying over the Bowman's layer, which is a modified part of the stroma. The stroma represents 90% of the total corneal thickness, and finally is the endothelium, which is resting on the Descemet's membrane. The sclera is the white of the eye. It consists of irregular lamellae of collagen fibers. Posteriorly, the sclera has an opening called the posterior scleral foramina, from which the optic nerve leaves the eye, passing to the cranial cavity. At the posterior scleral foramen, the sclera is continuous with the dural sheath of the optic nerve. The posterior scleral foramen is bridged with a layer of dense collagen fibers, called the lamina creprosa, through which the nerve fibers pass from the retina to the optic nerve. The thickest part of the sclera lies around the optic nerve, while the thinnest location is at the insertion of recti muscles. The sclera is separated from overlying conjunctiva by loose connective tissue, called the episclera. The sclera is an avascular tissue, so it appears white. The thickness of the sclera is 1 mm around the optic nerve, while 0.3 mm at the insertion of recti muscles. The strength of the sclera maintains the shape of the globe, as well as it provides a rigid base for the insertion of extraocular muscles. The sclera is formed of elastic fibers and dense fibrous tissue. These collagen fibers are arranged in a random order, creating irregular bundles causing the sclera to appear white in color, while the corneal fibers are more regularly arranged. The posterior scleral foramen is located at the back of the sclera, 3 mm medially and 1 mm above the posterior pole of the globe, through which the optic nerve containing the central retinal artery and veins pass from the eye to the cranial cavity. Because this is a weak area, damage to the optic nerve can occur when the intraocular pressure stays elevated over the time. The diagram shows the equator of the eye, which divides the outer coat into anterior and posterior parts. The posterior part of the sclera is pierced by blood vessels and nerves to supply the intraocular structures. Another diagram shows the insertion of extraocular muscles to the sclera, and how the blood vessels and nerves can pierce the sclera to enter inside to supply the intraocular structures. The limbus is a transition zone between the clear cornea and the opaque sclera. The conjunctiva starts at the limbus, and it starts to cover the anterior part of the sclera and provides blood supply to the underlying sclera. The conjunctiva is a thin vascular mucous membrane that lines the eyelids from the inside, then reflected to cover the anterior part of the sclera. The conjunctiva can be divided into palpebral, bulbar, and forniceal conjunctiva. The middle coat of the eye is the vascular layer, and it's called the uvea. It's heavily pigmented as well as being vascular. It's formed of iris, ciliary body, and choroid. The iris is the most anterior part of the uvea. It is a thin circular disc perforated centrally by the pupil. Contraction of the iris sphincter muscle constricts the pupil, while contraction of the dilator pupillae muscle dilates the pupil. Inflammation of the iris part is called anterior uveitis or iritis. The ciliary body is the intermediate part of the uveal tissue. It is located between the iris anteriorly and the choroid posteriorly. Inflammation of the ciliary body is called intermediate uveitis. The ciliary body is triangular in cross-section. The anterior side or the base of ciliary body is the shortest part, and it gives origin to the iris. The outer side lies against the sclera and is formed mainly of ciliary muscles, while the inner side is divided into two zones. The anterior part, which is called pars plicata, which is 2 mm, while the posterior part called the pars plana, which is 4 mm. The choroid is a dense vascular layer. It's formed of small, medium, and large-sized blood vessels, with pigment epithelial cells scattered in between the blood vessels. The small blood vessels called the choriocapillaris, and the whole choroid is separated from the retinal pigment epithelium by a basement membrane called the Bruch's membrane. The inner layer of the eye is the neurosensory layer. It's formed from neurosensory retina and retinal pigment epithelium. The retina is formed of 10 layers, and the junction between the retina and pars plana forms a scalloped border known as the oris serrata. The 10 layers of the retina are inner limiting membrane, ganglion cell layer, inner plexiform layer, inner nuclear layer, outer plexiform layer, outer nuclear layer, outer limiting membrane, photoreceptor layer, and lastly, retinal pigment epithelium. The optic nerve meets the posterior part of the globe, slightly nasal and above the posterior pole. Inside the eye, this point is seen as the optic disc. There is no light-sensitive cells on the optic disc and hence the blind spot of the eye. The optic nerve contains about 1 million nerve fibers, each of which has a cell body on the retina. The extraocular muscles. The eye has 6 extraocular muscles that help to move the eyeball in different directions, 4 recti and 2 obliques. All these muscles are supplied by the third cranial nerve, except the lateral rectus with 6th cranial nerve and the superior oblique with the 4th cranial nerve. Levator palpebrae superioris is another extraocular muscle, which is associated with the superior rectus muscle. It arises from the back of the orbit and runs along the roof of the orbit overlying the superior rectus. It is attached to the upper lid skin and the anterior surface of the tarsal plate of the upper eyelid. The orbit. The eyeballs lies within the bony orbits, which are located on either sides of the nose. They are quadrilateral pyramids with the base directed anterolateral and the apex directed posteromedial. The medial walls are parallel to each other, while the lateral walls diverge at the angle of 45 degrees. The orbit is surrounded by paranasal sinuses. Superiorly is the frontal sinus, while inferiorly is the maxillary sinus. On the medial side is the ethmoidal and sphenoidal air sinuses. The orbit is formed of 7 bones, forming 4 walls and 4 margins. The orbit is formed of 4 margins, superior, inferior, medial and lateral margins. The superior one is formed of frontal bone, while the inferior one is formed of maxilla and zygoma. The medial margin is formed of frontal and maxillary bones, while the lateral margin is formed of frontal and zygomatic bones. The volume of the orbit is 30 cc or 30 cubic millimeters. The adult orbit is usually considered to be approximately 40 millimeters in height, width, and depth. The diagram of the skull shows that the orbit is formed of 7 bones. These 7 bones are frontal, zygoma, maxilla, ethmoidal, sphenoidal, lacrimal, and palatine bones. The ocular adnexa. The eyelids are flexible and mobile multilayer structures that cover the eye anteriorly. When the eyelids are closed, they cover the globe. The upper and lower eyelids connect nasally and temporally at the canthi to form the palpebral fissure, which is 30 mm in width and 10 mm in height. The upper eyelid extends above the eyebrow, which separates it from the forehead, while the lower eyelid passes without line of demarcation into the skin of the cheek. The palpebral fissure is the space between the eyelids when the eyes are open, and it should be symmetrical between both eyes. When the eye is in the primary position, the upper lid should cover 2 mm of the superior cornea, while the lower lid should rest on the inferior corneal limbus. The eyelids are formed of 2 layers, anterior and posterior layers. The anterior layer is formed of skin and muscle layer, while the posterior layer is the tarsoconjunctival layer. At the lid margin, the anterior and posterior lamellae of the eyelids can be separated at the gray line. Anterior to the gray line is the lash follicles, while posterior to the gray line is the meibomian gland orifices. The lid margin is about 2 mm in thickness, and it has a sharp posterior border and rounded anterior border. The rounded anterior border has hair follicles of the eyelashes, into which the sebaceous gland of the eyes opens. When the follicle is blocked, the resident bacteria multiply and cause suppurative inflammation of the size gland called a style, which is always related to an eyelash follicle. Anterior to the gray line of the eyelid margin is the opening of special glands present in the substance of tarsus called the meibomian glands. When the follicles is blocked, the resident bacteria multiply and cause suppurative inflammation of the meibomian gland called chalazion. The eyelids acts to protect the eye from the external environment, also production of tear film and blinking action to spread the tear film over the eye. The production of watery layer of tear film is mainly from the lacrimal gland, which occupies the superior-temporal part of the orbit. It has ducts that open into palpebral conjunctiva above the upper lid border of the upper tarsus. The lacrimal apparatus drains the tear film. Tears collects at the medial part of palpebral fissure and pass through the lacrimal passage. The lacrimal passage is formed of two puncti, two canaliculi, and the common canaliculus that terminate into the lacrimal sac. Then the lacrimal sac terminates in the nasolacrimal duct inferiorly. The nasolacrimal ducts open into the inferior meatus of the nose. Blood supply of the eye. The arterial blood supply. The blood supply of the globe is derived from three sources: the central retinal artery, anterior ciliary arteries, and posterior ciliary arteries. All these are derived from the ophthalmic artery, which is a branch of internal carotid artery. The diagram shows the internal carotid artery, which gives off the ophthalmic artery with its branches. Venous drainage of the eye. The eye drains into central retinal vein and vortex veins. Both of them drain into superior and inferior ophthalmic veins that ends into the cavernous sinus. The picture shows superior and inferior ophthalmic veins draining into the cavernous sinus. The cavernous sinus is a paired-dural venous sinus located within the cranial cavity. It is divided by septa into small caves. Each cavernous sinus has a close anatomical relationship with several key structures in the head. It is the most clinically important venous sinus. Blood-ocular barriers. The blood-ocular barriers are essential for controlling the microenvironment of the ocular tissues. They are equivalent to the blood-brain barriers. Like the brain, the eye requires strict control to optimize cellular function and prevent toxicity. The blood-ocular barriers are formed of blood-aqueous barrier and blood-retinal barrier. Nerve supply of the eye. Apart from the optic nerve, the posterior pole of the globe is perforated by several long and short ciliary nerves. These short and long ciliary nerves contain parasympathetic, sympathetic, and sensory fibers, which mainly supply the muscles of the iris, ciliary body, and the cornea. The visual pathway. The ability to see is dependent on the clarity of images reaching to the brain. The visual pathway is made of axons which connect the retina to the occipital cortex of the brain. The visual pathway is formed of four order neurons. The first order neuron lies within the cells of the retina, while the second order neuron starts from the ganglion cells of the retina still the optic tract. The third order neuron lies within subcortical centers, while the fourth order one lies within the optic radiation and visual cortex. Thank you.